Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast. I'm Alexandra Pisatsky, telecom reporter with the Globe and Mail, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the Globe and Mail headquarters is situated is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. If you need technical help during the webcast, please click the help desk icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A box on the right, and I'll be taking some of your questions a little later on. Today, we're talking about ransomware and the risks and considerations it poses for business. Cyber attacks such as ransomware are becoming more sophisticated, and the pandemic has certainly changed the threat landscape. We have an excellent group of business speakers and experts to address the topic. Today's webcast is sponsored by IBM, and we have a representative from IBM on our panel today, along with other business leaders who are joining independently. Now let's introduce them. First, we have Brad Stocking, Associate Partner for Cloud and Infrastructure Security with IBM. Next, we have Sumit Bhatia, Director of Innovation and Policy with Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst at Ryerson University. Also joining us is Susie Solomon, an Associate with Norton Rose Fulbright Canada. And last but not least, we have Randy Wallinga, Director of Information Technology, Teaching and Learning Services with DeGroote School of Business. Thanks for joining me today. So just to kick things off, for those in the audience who aren't familiar with ransomware, Sumit, could you provide a quick sort of explanation and maybe an example?
Yes, thanks, Alexandra. Thanks for having me here. In the simplest terms, ransomware is a form of digital extortion, typically executed via a malicious software or malware that has the ability to infect a computer and via it a network or a larger infrastructure, and then encrypts that data and the systems and holds them hostage in an effort to extort money. Now, there can be different types of ransomware attacks or softwares that can have the same impact, but with slight differences in how they do that, how they attack, how they infect a computer. But the end result is usually either limiting or denying access to systems and data, and at times threatening to release that information or sensitive information until that party has paid, usually in the form of cryptocurrency, to an anonymous and untraceable crypto wallet. So that, I'd say, is the general definition of ransomware as we know it currently.
And what are some of the trends that you're seeing that might be sort of contributing to this rise in the prevalence of ransomware attacks?
Yeah, there's several trends that are contributing to the proliferation of ransomware. We're seeing a lot of different modes of collaboration happening right now in this space. There's something that we refer to as a ransomware as a service, which is really attackers collaborating with each other, systems and infrastructure to launch these attacks. In these cases, very similar to a software as a service model, which many of us are familiar with, hostile operators will rent out their technology and their infrastructure to attackers so that they can launch mass scale attacks. We're also seeing now attackers get bold enough to launch what they call a pay to stay away attack. That is, they're demonstrating their ability to attack, but will not actually do so, but instead warn the organizations to pay them before they launch a full-scale attack. And this is usually directed at companies that may not have all of the resources or expertise to modify or adjust their systems in time for a future attack. We're also seeing, a rise in supply chain attacks, which we've heard of a ton about in 2021, where instead of attacking one party, the attackers will expand their blast radius to multiple parties within a software supply chain through one single point of compromise. And then one that we've been talking a lot about is just the human element, which is associated with the great resignation that we're hearing about, which is really about, when you've got new employees being onboarded, they usually take an additional time to get onboarded on security best practices, organizational protocols, learning how to use systems effectively, not to mention the time it takes to train and onboard new employees, leaving a period of vulnerability. So as a result of this, we're seeing another sort of trend as to how to capitalize on that, not to mention that because of the pandemic, we're seeing more disgruntled and fatigued workers we're also not as attentive to some of these issues, which again leaves systems vulnerable. So those are just some trends that we're noticing in why ransomware is getting so prevalent.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to pass it over to Susie. Can you tell us sort of what the main risks to businesses who experience a ransomware attack are?
Yeah, for sure. So as Sumit noted, ransomware attacks generally will encrypt systems or data, and it makes them inaccessible to the organization, which causes operational disruptions. And there are great risks there, financially and operationally, because you're going to suffer very serious business interruptions generally. If you're in the retail space, you might not be able to process orders for a period of time. If you're a financial institution, you might not be able to process applications, or if you're in the healthcare space, you might not have access to healthcare records and whatnot. So all of these operational disruptions could cause serious financial losses. And an organization will want to get back up as quickly and securely as possible, so that while you're managing kind of your operational risk and your financial risk from that perspective, you're going to have customers or clients, vendors, other business partners, whatever it is, asking questions. They're going to notice that something's up. They're not going to have access to what they usually have access to, or their order hasn't been shipped, and you're going to get a lot of questions. So you're going to also be working on managing those questions that are coming in, deciding how much information you share, what you're telling people. All of that takes up time and resources. At the same time, media might be picking up on it. They might be asking questions. So you have all of these different competing obligations that require time and resources. But you also have legal and regulatory risks. And as a lawyer, I like to think that those are the most important risks, but really they're just one of the many things you have to deal with after suffering a ransomware attack. So on the legal and regulatory side, you might have contractual obligations to vendors or business partners, where you either have to notify them if there is a security breach or a privacy breach, and you might have obligations to maintain their confidential information, breach of contract on that front. And also, if there's a privacy breach as a result of a ransomware attack, you could face lawsuits from individuals, including class action lawsuits and investigations from the relevant regulators, which could come with fines and penalties. So all of these things cost money. And we're seeing ransomware attacks becoming very common at Norton Rose Fulbright. In Canada last year, we did over 300 breaches where we helped clients mitigate their financial risk and ensure their brand wasn't prejudiced. And so really, I think people know that these things happen, and it's really important. You're not going to be judged on the fact that you had a ransomware attack most of the time, but you will be judged on how well you manage and respond to that incident.
Mm-hmm. Wow, over 300. What would you say are kind of the best practices in terms of responding to one of these attacks? Is there sort of a checklist for business leaders? Pardon me, sorry.
Yeah, everybody looks for a checklist. I mean, there's steps that you should take, but really you should look at it and triage it based on what you're facing currently. So you do kind of have to look at what your risks are at the time. But some of the first steps you should definitely be taking is disconnecting or segregating any devices that you think are impacted to kind of keep that ransomware attack from spreading as much as possible. Immediately, you should notify your chief information officer or general counsel, whoever it is in the organization that's responsible for kind of leading the response, and notify your insurer right away to let them know that there may be a cyber claim coming in. Your insurer can usually connect you with service providers that are approved for coverage, but also vetted for their expertise. They generally recommend that you retain legal counsel, external legal counsel right away. And that's really important for a few different reasons. Number one is having legal counsel that's experienced in breaches can help you manage the process. There's a lot of different parties involved. And as I said, I mean, there's no one size fits all way to handle it. So somebody who's experienced can lead you through that and give you good advice. The other thing is if you're doing it yourself or with counsel that's not as experienced, they may take a more conservative view, and that might be costly both financially and from a reputational perspective. I think the kind of bigger aspect of why it's good to have legal counsel, though, is to maintain privilege. So privilege is a concept where if documents or communications are privileged, they may not be producible in court or in the case of a regulatory investigation. So legal counsel will generally retain your service providers, whether that's your forensic investigators, your communications consultants, or other people, and those sensitive information can be protected. It won't be required to be disclosed. And finally, legal counsel can advise on your legal and regulatory risks. And then some of the kind of other things that you have to think about is notifying law enforcement, notifying your board, getting senior leadership on board with your strategy. So those are kind of your main things to start thinking about at the beginning.
Thank you. I want to pass it over to Brad now. What would you say is the most important thing that business leaders should keep in mind as they try to keep their systems safe? Oh, you're muted.
Of course, you think I would learn with COVID. Sorry, folks. So yeah, that's and it's a difficult thing to answer. Much like Susie had mentioned, there's no one size fits all, right? It has to be custom to each organization, whether it's the size of their organization, the type of business that they conduct, or just overall the key offerings you're providing to your clients. What I'd say is some of the steps, and Susie had touched on a bunch of them. One of the things really to hoist aboard is to understand your key lines of business, how it could impact your customers, and then start discussing the potential protections you can put in place, right? And the reason being is, if you want to protect against the ransomware threat, and that's great, but you also have to continue to conduct operations, right? And conduct your business and satisfy your company's mission. So if you lock down in such a way that it hinders that, that's also problematic. So companies are often trying to balance that. So if you're able to understand what is key to your business success, and then flip it on its head and think about the motivation of the attackers and how you would have to protect against a motivated attacker against your organization, then you can start structure, how you put security defense in place, and what is the response action that Susie started touching on with, cyber insurance and your incident response plan, who you notify, and all those fine things. One thread I will pull on quickly is ransomware under the hood with the technology is nothing new. This technology has been around forever. What's interesting of it, and the technology changes all the time. What's interesting with it is that it's the motive, it's what the attackers are doing with that underlying technology. We talk about extortion, we talk about, and Sumit had talked about, they're looking to essentially provide protection services in advance, and it's no small wonder that a lot of these activities, ransomware as a service and everything Sumit is talking to, is backed by organized crime often, whether it's, in Russia, throughout the globe. Organized crime often backs these sort of ransomware campaigns, providing ransomware as a service. So if you're able to understand your lines of business, understand the threats that would focus on your key data in your business, then you can start, the technology is going to change. The technology ransomware uses is going to change, but you can understand the motivations and the targets that will be within your organization. And I'd say that's a key area to focus on for sure.
Mm-hmm. And is it realistic for businesses to aim for 0 cyber attacks?
No, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? That's always a question you hear, like, can we be fully impenetrable, right? Can we build Fort Knox? And the truth is, no one's above it. And we've seen that with various attacks throughout some massive players in the industry who have very robust security programs. There's always a weakness that an enemy can exploit. One of the key ones, and one of the trends we're seeing within our IBM X-Force Threat Intelligence aperture and service, is that there's triple extortion ransomware threats coming out, where they're not only looking to target the direct company, but suppliers that you're using or other vendors that you're using to support your own line of business. They're going to attack them and then use them to extort you as well. So the supply chain becomes very important. Who you're working with, understanding when you use them for key services, or they protect your data or store your data, work with your data, that you understand fundamentally what kind of security they're bringing to the table, and if they're prepared in these, triple extortion ransomware scenarios.
Mm-hmm. I want to pass it over to Randy now. And I understand, the role of employees in ransomware is quite significant. So can you tell us a little bit about phishing and how these attacks are changing, and how easy is it to fall for one of these attacks?
Well, 20 years ago, we might get an email from a Nigerian prince, right, offering to transfer $10 million, and all we had to do was give him our banking information. So it's evolved now where it's going to be very, from a trusted source, it's going to be very targeted type of information. So it might be, for example, from what appears to be Google about your Gmail account, or what appears to be your HR department about new COVID protocols for coming back to work, or it's going to be something that's that looks very real, and it's going to appear to come from a trusted source, and the whole idea is for you to click on it. So how easy is it to click on these things? About 20% of the people that are tested on average will click the link. 14% of those will download a file, and 13% will actually enter their credentials. So multi-factor authentication is really important, especially for those 13%. What we would do is always use really effective user awareness training to bring those percentages down. And as Brad said, it'll never get down to zero, but it's about bringing it down. I think the employees are the first line of defense.
Mm-hmm. And what does this training sort of reveal, or what do these tests kind of reveal about training needs? What can you learn from doing these phishing campaigns?
Well, if you have a user awareness campaign already, or if you're thinking about implementing one, if you do a phishing campaign, it can show you kind of where you are and the things you need to focus on. So is your campaign working? Are you communicating effectively? Are you getting these percentages down? Are there specific people that maybe you need personalized feedback? Maybe they need, specialized one-on-one training or something. It's never going to be something to kind of point anyone out. It should be used as a tool for how we can do our training better and more effective. And it also creates changes the culture from kind of automatic trust to more of being cautious. So we're also changing how employees view things.
Mm-hmm. So one of the big questions that I'm sure everyone in the audience is dying to know, and I'd love for all of you to answer this one, though maybe we could start with Susie, is, if your company is the target of one of these ransomware attacks, should you pay? So Susie, what are you kind of seeing among your clients? How many pay, and what factors go into making that decision?
Yeah, so it's really a business risk decision that organizations have to make when they fall victim to these ransomware attacks. We kind of model it out for our clients. There are three main scenarios where clients tend to consider making ransom payments. The first scenario is where you require a decryptor. Either your IT infrastructure is inoperable, or your backups are either encrypted or destroyed. When that's the case, you may think about making a ransom payment. It really depends on the state of your backups. And let's say you have a good backup from 4 months ago. How much is it going to cost you to recreate 4 months worth of data? So that all kind of factors into it. Another situation you might think about making ransom payment is to protect and prevent the personal information or sensitive information from being leaked. Something we're commonly seeing, especially in the last 2 years, is a double extortion technique where the threat actor not only encrypts your data in your systems, but they'll also steal data and hold it ransom and demand a ransom payment. Otherwise, they're going to sell it on the dark web or publish it on the dark web for free. And so that's actually happening, I think, within the last year in a majority of cases, or at least the threat actor claims to have your data. And so in that case, if you think that the threat actor has, your trade secrets or your crown jewels, your competitive advantage, you may think about making that ransom payment. Or if they have very sensitive information of your clients or customers or whatever it is, you may do that to mitigate risks. if it makes sense to do so. Finally, I think the last reason that people sometimes make ransom payments is it's considered essentially a nuisance payment. So you don't need a decryptor. You don't really care about the data that might be published, but you're worried about your reputation. The threat actors claiming to, go online and say that they were able to get into your systems and that they stole your data, and they're just going to shame you on the internet. And so you may pay a lower kind of ransom for that inconvenience. Those are kind of the three main situations where you might pay. What I'll say is that in Canada, it's not illegal to make a ransom payment, but it is illegal to pay money to certain sanctioned groups or organizations. And so sanctions checks should be done. I don't recommend that people negotiate or organizations negotiate with threat actors themselves. There are specialized negotiators who do this regularly that should be engaged. They have intel on the different threat actor groups. They can, tell you what different threat actor groups are likely to do, and they have different strategies they can employ, whether it is to negotiate a better deal or just to gain intel to know what they've done. All of that is really important. The negotiators will also do the sanctions check just to make sure you're not paying money to a group you're not supposed to pay money to. So all in all, I mean, I think it really depends on the specific circumstances, what the ask is, and whether it makes sense to pay. It is a pros and cons analysis. But I would say there have been different studies, and just in my personal experience, it's probably about half, maybe a little more than half, that do pay. There was a study that came out just a few days ago from an IT company, and their figures were about the same.
Mm-hmm. Sumit, I see you nodding your head. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Susie touched on a lot of the important points. I'll perhaps just add that one of those pieces around reputation is a big part of why often organizations will pay. And that's also the case with small and medium businesses who sometimes may not have experts at the table or the ability to go get a professional negotiator. But one of the why I raised that is that we also have the role as an audience and as consumers to play in that reputational risk. The more we make our audiences and the general public aware of these issues and why paying ransomware continues to propagate a negative mechanism, then we'll continue to be able to create more opportunities for organizations to be able to feel comfortable with that information being released while they've done their own work internally to protect their systems and, of course, follow some of the recommendations that Susie mentioned. So that's the only piece I wanted to add, is that we as a collective have a role to educate and be aware of some of these scenarios so that we can actually support the organizations in their cause.
Brad, Randy, do you have anything else to add on that one?
I think that they touched on everything. I just want to add, I guess, that it's recommended not to pay, but it really is a business decision, as was touched on. But all of the major security organizations would recommend not paying whenever possible.
And why is that?
Because as Summit touched on, it kind of it creates this industry. It encourages them to continue doing it.
And if you do pay, how do you know that they're not just going to publish on the internet anyway?
Yeah, you don't.
Definitely, that's something you should consider within your risk analysis. There's never a guarantee that a threat actor will follow through on what they say. They generally do, but that doesn't mean they always will. And we've seen it in our practice as well, where millions of dollars were paid in a ransom and nothing was handed over at the end. So, you can't always trust criminals, that's for sure.
Over to Brad. I know there's sort of a perception out there that small businesses aren't a target as often for these attacks because, the bad actors rather go after the big fish. Is that true?
Well, no, Alex, and I touched on it previously with that whole supply chain and triple extortion, right, where they start targeting other companies you're working for. So if you think of, if you pass a lot of your sensitive data, say you're a shop, even a legal firm, and you're working with a translation shop, right? It could be that shop comes under target, right? It could be a small business used for translation services, could be whatever, right? And so they'll often look for those organizations that you're working with and see if that's either a launch pad to get in your organization, or if you're exchanging sensitive data with that organization and they can use that as an avenue for extortion, right? So small businesses, if they're supporting larger businesses, become a target. And then regardless, if you're thinking of any small shop that deals with any data from a customer, if they have intellectual property, say they're a small tech startup, say they also have health information of some sort. There's all sorts of sensitive information out there that they absolutely will become a target for ransomware.
Mm-hmm. And the challenge is that they may not have the same IT budgets, right, as a larger organization. So what kind of strategies can, small to medium-sized enterprises use to kind of keep themselves protected?
And it's really a difficult space, and we've touched on that in a previous panel of how do we bring cyber to small and medium business, right? Because it's the cost of entry. If we think of what we want to do within the innovation space within Canada and fostering these tech startups, fintechs, all these smaller entrepreneurial explorations, the cost of entry, if we put too much of a regulatory requirement on them to secure, then they won't be able to start up, right? And there'll be the burden to start up would be too high. So what I'd say is the first thing I'd mention where they have to understand what their business is, understand why an attacker would be motivated to attack them, what their key targets or data that the attackers would target. Understanding that is a great first step, because then you can right size what you're doing security wise, right? And largely, what we keep getting caught with are the attackers exploiting just the low hanging fruit, right? So misconfigurations of your environment, not improper management of your IT assets, some of the basics, the fundamentals in security. So before we start, ask that small organizations start looking at the most advanced threats and employing the most costly techniques, just doing the fundamentals, a solid patch program, knowing the assets you have, knowing where you'll be targeted, employing vendors to support you where they can. If you do those fundamentals, you'll be much further ahead of the game than a lot of companies who they go to advanced technology and ignore some of those fundamentals.
Perfect. So we've kind of talked a lot about the idea of making cybersecurity a business issue and not just a technical issue. So Sumit, how can companies do that on sort of a day-to-day practical level?
Yeah, Alex, I think it's perhaps important to recognize why it's not just a technical issue. And I know we touched on a few of those things today, and different panelists have talked about it. But the impact of ransomware to a business is happening across different lines of business. There's clearly a financial impact. We know that just in your capacity to pay. So a small, medium business could be a crippling effect in comparison to an enterprise. But we also know there's the operational issue. Is during that downtime, how do you conduct business? And I know a few of my fellow panelists have talked about that as well, is what are some of the measures that you can put in place to overcome that operational risk? But then you've got the issue of trust that we talked about, trust from your customers and your partners in working with you. There's a reputational issue at stake. And of course, there's the technical threat and dealing with both the current and the future state of your technical infrastructure. So from a risk perspective, all of those make this much larger than just a technical issue. I think that's why it's imperative to make cybersecurity an organizational and cultural concern and get buy-in and participation from all levels and all departments within an organization. This work can certainly be led and should be led top down, where management and boards are emphasizing the importance of cybersecurity and creating opportunities for employees to participate, whether that's through awareness training, which I think is a very critical component of it, maybe developing ambassadors within the organization from team to team, department to department, who can carry that mandate forward. But then some of the most fundamental things, right? Like proper cyber hygiene training, just the exercise of doing things consistently on a daily basis when engaging with technology. Better understanding of social engineering techniques. And I know a few folks talked about that here as well. Just how it's working to trick people and how to recognize it. Things like, Randy talked about sample phishing simulations, so teams get used to encountering such attacks and how to address them but also think about how to develop a reporting mechanism so employees know how to follow up on suspicious activity. Not all suspicious activity will necessarily translate, but just knowing how to escalate that and then having a clearly outlined incident response plan so that they know what their role is in some of these scenarios is going to be critical. And of course, as an organization, it's very important to have a business continuity plan to mitigate that operational risk as well as other areas, just so you know how you're going to conduct business going forward. I think finally, one has to approach these threats with a business mindset. And that's where we need a cultural shift in recognizing that this is now an inherent risk of doing business. As Brad pointed out, it's not if, it's when. So recognizing that, you just have to take that into consideration, that risk into consideration in every business decision and every action on a day-to-day basis, recognizing the potential cost that is associated with an attack. So those are some things that I think we can do on a day-to-day basis, and just getting our teams and our organization at large to participate in making this a business issue.
Mm-hmm. And I know we kind of touched on, phishing attacks, but I understand it's not the only sort of attack vector that there is. So Brad, could you maybe tell us about some other types of attacks that we're seeing?
Yeah, for sure, Alex. And what I'd say is phishing absolutely is a key entry point to a lot of organizations. And Sumit talked on social engineering. Phishing is largely an activity in that social engineering bucket where, and Randy touched on it quite well, that, it went from being very broad strokes, attempts, what they often call pray and spray, where they just, send out emails to as many addresses as they can with really wide open attempts. But then they get into spear phishing where they focus and beyond, where they really get into focus on, some of the organizational specifics, so they can get the various people to click, to download, to do whatever action that the attacker wants them to do. But beyond that, like the front line, your day-to-day users, while that is an initial attack vector, the supply chain, as I touched on, is very critical, right? And for instance, there's been trusted vendors who've been compromised throughout the past couple of years, where a company uses them for key management software within their environment, and they trust that vendor, so they pull in data from that vendor, like software updates and such. Meanwhile, that vendor was compromised, so the updates they're pulling are actually malicious in nature. And so, and the SolarWinds hack in the winter of 2020 is a perfect example of that, where SolarWinds is a trusted vendor for a lot of companies, used for network management. The updates had been compromised, and it impacted a lot of major organizations, including Microsoft, right? So while the low-hanging, not the low-hanging fruit, but the easier target, which are your user base, is critical, there are many other attack vectors. And what you have to do as an organization, and I touched on it, thinking through the threat, thinking through the motivations will draw out some of those other attack vectors. And those are very important to think through.
Mm-hmm. We're getting tons of audience questions, so I'm going to start tossing those into the mix. There's one question here just asking if Randy could please repeat the percentages as to how many staff will click on phishing emails or download malware.
So based on a study done in 2021 with 1 million phishing emails sent out to a variety of industries and types and sizes of organizations, 19.8% clicked the email, 14.4% downloaded the attachment, and 13% entered their credentials.
There's also, quite a few questions here about the cloud, and, does having your information in the cloud with a recognized provider decrease business risk or increase it? What's the effect there?
I'll quickly jump in there, Alex. I think it's important to recognize that we have a shared responsibility in a cloud environment. A lot of the cloud providers, especially the well-recognized ones, are putting a ton of best practices in place and ensuring their infrastructure and their systems are well protected, and that can be leveraged by their audiences as well. But I think it's important to recognize that we often end up using cloud as sort of just a generic general word to define different types of services that are available, but also recognizing that in order to access your cloud, you're using your own computers, your own networks, your own passwords often, and these are all part of that threat vector that can be leveraged to launch an attack. So there's a responsibility on the part of the user. On the other side, when you engage with a cloud provider, you're also entering a service level agreement where you're agreeing to certain quality of service, and that comes at a certain cost. And so it's very important to recognize that when you're setting up those service level agreements, when you're engaging in them, where does your responsibility begin and end as a user, and where does theirs begin and end? And of course, also asking some key questions in that process. You know, one of the big questions I always encourage folks to ask is, where is my data going to be stored? Cloud providers may offer that information, but recognizing that just even something like a data storage location can change your legal responsibility and legal ramifications associated with it. Those are all things that are important to know. So I think, yes, cloud providers are doing a tremendous job of making sure their end is protected and they're continuing to advance, but we have to make sure that we educate ourselves on our responsibility moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's music to my ears. Sorry, Sumit. I'm so happy to hear all the legal.
If I can jump in there, what Sumit just spoke about is humongous, because what we're seeing across cloud breaches, any sort of information breach related to cloud deployments, is that a lot of the time it's a misunderstanding of those shared responsibilities he's just spoken about. So getting to the SLA and understanding that is a huge first step in understanding what responsibilities you have as a client to that cloud provider. And there are often big misinterpretations there. So that's something key to really latch onto, and then really think through what technical capabilities you have to bring aboard, because a lot of times organizations, they will move into the cloud as though it's a rapid way to bring a lot of resources, technical resources to bear. They don't understand those responsibilities, and they're not prepared with the appropriate security technology they need to make that move secure, right? And it's happened throughout COVID, where a lot of companies all of a sudden had to really bolster their business lines of business, and they used cloud as a facilitator to that acceleration. And in the meantime, security teams got left behind, right? So that's something that businesses really have to open their eyes on, knowing that they're stepping into a new environment. It's going to stretch their operational teams across other systems they already have, and that the responsibilities have to be crystal clear.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking a lot about sort of business risk, and there's a question here asking about individual risk. Are individuals also at risk for ransomware attacks? And if so, what can they do to protect themselves?
Who wants to jump in? I can take that on, and I mean, yeah, I can take it on, because it's, we talk about the information for clients, right, and that being held hostage, and then the company being extorted, but we all have information that we have to protect, right? And when you think through the whole concept of identity theft and a lot of the sensitive information we have, absolutely individuals can be targeted. And even as there's a reason why a lot of webcams have covers over them that you can slide. That there has been examples of devices being hacked, cameras being activated, pictures being taken when not appropriate, and that being used to extort an individual, right? So this is happening all over the place. So I mean, there's no easy answer for that, Alex. In truth, for the individual, you have to do a bit of homework, right? Looking into how you manage passwords across a lot of your accounts. And this is a reality of our digital age, is that there are a proliferation of accounts that we have to manage. And so trying to memorize all those passwords, people take shortcuts. And that's often one of those, Randy talked on multi-factor authentication. If that's available with the account, use it, but sometimes it's not. So in that case, there's recommendations from the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity on how to secure your home office, how to secure your home accounts. Go through, make sure you use a password manager, good hygiene on your computer, that you have antivirus, that it's up to date, that you deploy patches. These are all good things individuals should be doing. And then really think about how you're using social media and how your data is out there, because all that data can be used against you. So it's anything you put out there is, open hunting for the attackers.
Alex, if I might jump in there quickly, is just to add that the lines between individual and organization from a technology perspective have gotten blurred as a result of the pandemic. We know that folks, employees, people are using their personal devices to access corporate systems. We know that they haven't configured their networks with the same protocols as would happen in an office environment. As Brad pointed out, our password managers sometimes aren't integrated with personal systems, not to mention that now we're using multiple systems in a home environment. We're using our cell phones and our tablets and other devices to access data as well. So from an individual's perspective, what's important to keep in mind is that the threat vectors, of course, have expanded, but with the rise of services like the ransomware as a service, and how Randy talked about just the broad volume-based attacks that we are seeing, it's not about dollar value as it is becoming about volume when it comes to attacking individuals. And so they are as lucrative and as viable when you've got a larger population of people falling for that. And in the current state, there's a lot of fear, and we know that fear propagates irresponsible behavior, or sometimes just that fear will lead to an action that doesn't take into consideration some of the things like misinformation being spread through accounts that seem familiar but are actually nefarious accounts. So I think it's important for the individual to just recognize that in the current state, in the current environment, and in the environment moving forward, where we are going to most likely see a hybrid work environment, that they have a responsibility as an individual to protect their companies and enterprises and businesses, but in that process also protect themselves.
Can I add one more thing to that? Is it really is blurred, as someone was saying. If people are working remotely, companies don't have necessarily control of employees' systems, and so when they're targeted, the company itself could be targeted. Some of the things that Brad touched on that I think are really important is the passwords, making sure your system is patched, obviously having antivirus. Everything has to be up to date. One other thing for the individual I would suggest is Google Have I Been Pwned, and there's a website there. Put in your various email account for various accounts, and it will tell you if that user has been compromised in any of the various companies, and then you can go and you can look at all of those and realize you need to change your password quickly and be careful about using the same passwords everywhere. It's very eye-opening if you go to that website.
I'm gonna have to check that out. I have a question here for Susie, which is, we kind of talked about duty to report, and this audience member is asking, what are a company's obligations to report attacks, even like if no data was stolen? Is there still a duty to report?
That's a really good question. I mean, so you do have notification or reporting obligations where data might have been accessed by an unauthorized third party or stolen. So I'll actually put it into 3 buckets. You have your obligations where there's been a privacy breach. So it's really important to distinguish between a ransomware attack and a privacy breach. Just because you've suffered a ransomware attack, it doesn't mean that there's been a privacy breach, which you really do rely on your forensics investigations in that case to figure out what the threat actor did while they were in your systems. They can generally determine what files and folders they access, whether data was actually taken out of the system, how much data was taken out of the system, and things like that. So there's actually 24 different data protection laws in Canada, and which ones will apply to you or your organization will vary. It really depends on the nature of the organization. So private sector is different from federally regulated or provincially regulated organizations. It makes a difference if you're a commercial business or a nonprofit, where you're based in Canada and where you have business organizations set up. the type of information involved, so personal information versus personal health information, and if the data crosses provincial or national borders. So that all informs which statute will apply. Just to give you a general example, on the personal information front, in the private sector, for-profit, if there's been a privacy breach that results in a real risk of significant harm, and that's not just identity theft or financial loss. It could be humiliation or damage to reputation or relationships. So it's quite a broad definition. Then you have a duty to notify, and you have a duty to report to the regulator. So that's the federal legislation that would apply to most provinces other than BC, Alberta, and Quebec. But that's one bucket. Then you have, if you're a regulated industry, there's other notification obligations. So you may have a duty to report to your regulator if there's been a security breach or a privacy breach. So if you're in financial services, health services, telecommunications, there could be other obligations to notify people or to report. And there's a business reality to it too. You might not have a duty to report. You might not be required to report, but you, as a business or organization within that regulated industry, want to have a good reputation with your regulator. So, in some cases, you may want to provide them with complimentary notification just to let them know, to kind of keep them in the loop and maintain that relationship. And then your final, in terms of notification obligation, could be to your vendors or other parties that you contract with, because you may have contractual obligations to let them know. I think that there should be methods in place within your organization to track those obligations. A lot of time there's a time limit attached to it, and you want to be able to kind of access that information fairly quickly.
Perfect, thank you. This one I'm really curious about. Is there any data indicating whether most ransomware attacks are from small-scale hackers versus large organized crime groups versus foreign states? I wonder if maybe Brad could take that one.
Yeah, I can, and it's Sumit and I both smiled because that's a really tough one to answer. And part of the lure of ransomware as a service, and this has been going on before ransomware. There's organizations that provide botnet as a service. They have botnets that you can buy and use. They have exploit kits that you can purchase and use. An exploit kit is something that is essentially a Swiss Army knife of attacks you can launch at, unsuspecting targets. So this has been going on for, ever, commoditizing the whole cyber attack business, right? And making that a service to people who otherwise don't have the skills to launch those or develop those, right? So, and the reason this is happening is because those organizations, when we get into organized crime in foreign states, there are then several levels of abstraction from attribution to the attack, right? They still get the outcome they're looking for, mass attacks launched on a target nation, Canada, the US, you name it, Ukraine, wherever, and then they can extract themselves from being attributed to that larger attack. So botnets have been used for that for years and years, but we're seeing that across the board. So those numbers are really difficult to get into because it's we see the front line, we do our initial investigation, but then it becomes a really difficult task to attribute unless you have more sensitive data collection.
Right. There's quite a few people asking for Brad to repeat the home office resource and for Randy to repeat the Google resource site.
So for the home office, and beyond home office, there's a lot of good graphics. So the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity is a federal agency that provides all sorts of service to Canada, from the public sector into individuals. There's how to secure your home office. There's how to avoid COVID-19 scams. There's cyber hygiene infographics. There's a lot of good resources there. There's actually even infographic and documents on small and medium business security. So it's a great set of resources that the Cyber Center is really pushing out to secure Canada.
So that website is haveibeenpwned.com. Pwned is spelled PWNED. So you could Google that or just type out have I been PWNED.com. Enter the email address you use for whatever ones you have, Gmail, whatever, or corporate ones, and it will tell you if that account has been compromised in any number of companies, where you use that.
Mm-hmm. And Randy, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Randy, while we've got you, there's a question here. I know you've kind of touched on this, but maybe I can roll it in with another question. And that is sort of, what is the best way to sort of train your employees and also to measure maturity on ransomware preparedness? So how prepared your business is?
Oh, good. I get a hard one. I don't know if there's any best way. It's going to depend on the culture of the organization and the size of the organization. I can say there's a couple of things that you want to make sure of. It has to go to all levels through the organization, right, from bottom to top. Executive and senior management are really lucrative targets, so they don't get off easy. They need to take this too. I think that it's got to be ongoing, and it's not do it once and forget about it. It has to be continuous. It has to always be kind of front of mind, but it can't be too much that it's noise either. Doing the phishing campaigns or other tests or things like that might really depend on the culture of the organization. Some organizations don't want to do phishing campaign tests because they feel it might make their employees feel like they're being tricked by their own company. So it really depends on the culture as to what's best, but you've got to be able to measure your effectiveness. You need to, communication and positive feedback I find is important. So if somebody emails me and says, hey, is this email fake or not? And I'll say, yes, it is, but then I'll go on and explain exactly why, things that they can look at next time, and I think that the last thing some companies are able to do, again, if the culture allows it, is kind of gamify it to get people interested. That might be Cyber Hero of the Month or something, I don't know. But they try to make, the thing is to get the employees engaged and to get them learning. They have to learn about the basics, password and phishing and all that stuff. Like I said, it's a complex question. It really depends on the organization.
And Sumit, I think you wanted to add something as well on the last question.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe I'll just build on what Randy said. I think, exactly as you pointed out, it's complex, but I think the number one thing is changing the culture of an organization is very, very important. We know that this is all hands on deck sort of situation, and we need to make sure that everybody understands that from that perspective. Now, the other piece that I'd add is probably positive reinforcement. Rewarding good behavior on the parts of employees that are demonstrating that. I mentioned earlier the opportunity to develop ambassadors. But most of all, I think the link between, how fundamental technology is to every little small action and operation, so that they understand that, like washing your hands, you have to follow a certain cyber hygiene before every action that involves technology. And so I think exactly what Randy pointed out, shifting the culture, creating education mechanisms and frameworks that are consistently delivering a consistent message. And then, of course, rewarding good behavior and building ambassadors and building, providing them very actionable insights versus technical jargon, I think is going to be extremely useful. And last part, I'll say just, on what Brad was saying earlier is just, there's a ton of resources out there. Brad pointed out Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. I just wanted to also highlight the Cybersecure Canada program that is being launched for small, medium businesses to get certified. A lot of support on that front. It's a renewed program. And if I can shamelessly plug that we've launched a free program called Simply Secure for small and medium business owners to also get educated on the concept of why cyber risk is also business risk and then best practices. So lots of resources out there, but the work continues.
Perfect. There's a really interesting one here. An audience member says they're looking for advice on how much information to share with employees during attack because they're concerned that, the employees could go on social media and that could potentially add to the reputational risk. Susie, I wonder if you could answer that one.
For sure, I can definitely tackle this one. So with employees, I'll give you the usual lawyer answer, it depends. But really, I think you do want, one, in terms of employees going on social media and, outing what's happening, your employees generally do have a confidentiality clause in their agreements. So they are bound by confidentiality. So that might give you some comfort there. The other thing is you do have a relationship with your employees. You do want to keep them happy. I think there's a business reality to it that it's really important to keep that relationship positive with employees. So keeping them in the loop can help maintain that. You also need your employees on your side. It depends, I guess, what industry you're in, but your employees might be approached by customers or clients. It might be approached by the media, and if you can be open and honest with your employees and keep that relationship strong, they're going to do a good job for you. And I think that that's really important because they really do deal with a lot of the day-to-day questions that come in. And so that's important as well.
Perfect. So we are a bit tight on time, so I'm just going to ask one final question. There's been quite a few questions from the audience related to law enforcement. Can they be helpful during a cyber attack, and sort of how much are police authorities around the world kind of working together on kind of stopping and prosecuting these organizations, given that, of course, it is a cross-border issue? And I'm going to throw that one to Brad, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So the RCMP is right in the middle of this fight, right? And they present, a key resource in this. One of the problems they face, and they've stood up the National Cybercrime Coordination Unit to address this very thing within the Canadian space. But what they're finding is that they're not getting a lot of the reporting they would expect, and Canadians just don't know where to report. Whether there's identity theft or fraud or cybercrime, they don't know where to report. So if you go to the RCMP's website and you look up the National Cybercrime Coordination Unit, it'll point you to some resources. You also see that they're working on deploying a tool that will allow Canadians to report in from a centralized location, which is extremely important because they can't track and adapt to what they don't know, right? And as you can imagine, an RCMP officer in a debt office in remote Alberta, for instance, are they going to have all the cyber skills? No. But that's, these are some of the resources that the RCMP have to report to, and then they report back to the cybercrime unit. And what I'd say is we expect law enforcement to all be like Liam Neeson and Taken and, have a particular set of skills. It's not always the case, but they coordinate with other law enforcement agencies, like you said. They coordinate with the cybercrime unit at the center, and also within other organizations, including the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, right, and beyond. But there's, I would say that is one of the key things to hoist aboard, that law enforcement does take this very seriously. They've stood up the unit. They're working hard to build a centralized reporting mechanism, and they do work internationally with other law enforcement agencies.
I'm sure that's very reassuring for everyone to hear. So I'm just going to ask each of you for some quick closing remarks before we wrap up today. So I know we've covered tons of material here. If there's kind of one thing that you'd like people to kind of remember as they walk away from today's session, what would that be? And let's start with Susie, please.
Yeah, for sure. I think being prepared is really important. As much as you can prepare beforehand, the easier it'll be to respond if an incident happens. So having a cyber incident response plan is really important. Having, a policy that sets out who to contact, when to contact them, and all of who's responsible for what, super valuable. Data retention policies, reducing the amount of data that you hold on to, especially personal information, really important, and training also. So those are my closing remarks. Perfect.
And over to Sumit.
Thanks, Alex. Coming from an academic institution, I'm hard pressed to say education. Continue to build our awareness for all levels of organization and individual, and make sure that these resources are consistent in the messaging that's being provided, and that we continue to recognize that it is not a technology issue, and it's an individual issue as much as it is an organizational issue.
Perfect. Randy, closing thoughts from you.
Well, Susie took mine. It was incident response plan, and also a RACI chart, who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed for any incidents, so that it can come in on the frontline help desk, and that person shouldn't be making decisions about whether to bring the lawyers in. So that should all be laid out. Who's responsible? What are the next steps? And the other thing that I don't think that we talked a lot about was really good backup strategy.
And Brad, closing remarks from you.
Yeah, just say that we've touched on a lot of good points here. Security is a team sport. It can't be left alone to a couple security practitioners in your organization. So it's a whole organization approach. And the sooner organizations embrace that, the sooner the security team will understand what's key and core, to the core business of the organization and be able to support. And then when we talk about the positive reinforcement that Samit talked about, and having training, reporting, it becomes just a more collaborative ecosystem, and it's not this weird security team that's hidden in the corner, looking at malware, right? So make it a team sport, understand your business, and understand what are those key threats to your business, and then enforce the fundamentals.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Brad, Sumit, Susie, and Randy for joining us today. We're going to have to leave it there for today, but on behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to also thank IBM for their support of today's webcast, and to everyone in the audience. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this informative and helpful, and you will be sent a link to the recorded webcast in a couple of weeks if you registered for today's event. So thanks again to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.